Hi students, welcome back. It's Professor Bridget. We're now going to go over the first half of chapter 3, and this will be the last chapter before your first exam. So if we recall what we learned about last time, we learned about atoms and how they come together to make molecules. And we learned that bonds are what holds atoms together, and bonds represent energy. So we're going to build on that knowledge a little bit and look at the main molecules of cells, the biomolecules of life. You will find an Amoeba Sisters video and worksheet on this, and I think it's just called biomolecules. So let's get started. All of the molecules that we're going to learn about now in this chapter 3 lecture, these molecules of life are synthesized by living things. And synthesized just means made by. So living cells have to assemble these molecules. These living cells also use these molecules to carry out all the processes that occur inside of a cell. So not only do these cells make these molecules, but then they also use them for cellular processes. And up until now, I've really stressed the relationship between structure and function. And these molecules of life, they're going to be different in their three-dimensional structure. And because they differ in their three-dimensional structure, they're also going to differ in their functions. And I'll show you a couple of pictures of how these molecules can vary in structure. But one of the things that all of these molecules have in common, we sometimes call them organic molecules rather than just molecules of life. You can call them organic molecules. And organic just means contains carbon. So you might be familiar with foods that are organic. And this is kind of misleading because all of the foods that you put in your body should be organic. They should all contain carbon. An example of something that would be not organic or inorganic would be something like silica. Silica is essentially sand, right? Or minerals. Those would be things that do not contain carbon. So when we go to the grocery store and we're paying premium prices for organic foods, be mindful that all organic really means is that it's carbon-based. You wouldn't put anything in your body that's not carbon-based. Okay, so one thing all these molecules have in common, remember, is that they have a carbon backbone. Secondly, they have what are called attached functional groups. And functional groups are atoms or molecules that change the shape of the molecule and then also will alter the function of the molecule. And I'll show you some examples here in a bit. I feel like functional groups are kind of like accessories, where if you were to put on a pair of earrings or put on a nice watch, that changes your structure or your makeup just a little bit. And it wouldn't necessarily change how you function. But that's the way I feel about functional groups. They're kind of like accessories or add-ons that may or may not be made of carbon. Okay, so most organic compounds, like I said, they're all going to contain carbon. But mostly they contain carbon and hydrogen atoms. Carbon, as you know, can bond with up to 4 other atoms. So remember that carbon has 4 electrons in its valence shell, and that means it's got 4 available bonds that it can create. So here's a very common way to write a very simple molecule called methane. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Methane has 4 bonds made with hydrogen. Now this is really simple. You could draw this molecule as just its molecular formula and it would be CH3. But this is just a single carbon molecule. But more often than not, molecules have very long chains, or they're made up of very long chains of carbon, or in some cases they're organized in a ring. And so you might have, I'll just draw another simple one. So you'll have 4 carbons in this case. The 2 middle carbons are bonded to the carbons on the other side. So remember, if carbons can create up to 4 additional bonds, then each one of these carbons is going to be bonded to some other molecule. And I'll just make it real simple. Or sorry, not some other molecule. Well, it can be a molecule, it doesn't have to be an atom. But we'll make it real simple and we'll just put hydrogens there. So this first carbon can create up to 3 hydrogen bonds. And then its 4th bond is created with the carbon next to it. That carbon in the middle, let me change pens here so it doesn't get too confusing. That carbon in the middle can create 2 extra bonds because it's bonded to this carbon, but it's also already bonded to this carbon, so it only can make up to 2 additional bonds. And the same is true for this, ooh, that's a bad color, sorry. This 3rd carbon. And then the other carbon on the end, of course, can create 3 bonds because its 4th is between the 3rd and 4th carbon, okay? So the functional groups that we're going to find may or may not be carbon functional groups, but they're always going to attach to the carbon backbone. So I'll show you in a second what that looks like here. And so when we have these functional groups attached to that carbon backbone, they're going to influence the organic compound's properties or functions, or you could say even behaviors. Those functional groups are going to affect how those molecules, CH3 earlier, sorry, this is wrong. I wrote CH3. That's supposed to be CH4. I'm sorry for the cave. So as just kind of a reminder, these are different ways in which you might see molecules represented. This is what I was drawing earlier, where you have 1 carbon in the center and then hydrogen atoms bonded to it. That's CH4. You could see the ball and stick model where it actually shows you the positioning, how those hydrogen atoms organize themselves around the carbon. Or you could also view the space filling model, and that actually shows you the physical space taken up by the valence electrons. We're going to mostly use the structural formula. It's beyond kind of the scope of our course to get into using ball and stick models, although sometimes we'll show it, and sometimes I'll show space filling models. It's easiest to first utilize and learn on those structural formulas. So earlier I gave you the example of CH4, which has, remember, this conformation where you've got 4 hydrogens attached to just 1 carbon. But remember that these organic compounds often consist of chains of carbon. So in this particular molecule right here, there are 2 carbons, and you can see how the hydrogen atoms are bonded to those carbons. This is a compound called ethane, and this one right here, with just the 1 carbon, is called methane. All right, and then we can move to the next one, and here's propane. If you have a propane grill or use any camping devices or cooking devices, or any device really, not any device, but there are many devices that use propane gas. So propane has a chain of 3 carbons, and then hydrogens bonded to those carbons. Let me erase that here real quick, and I want to just kind of explain to you, kind of make a link between this week and last week's material. In that, remember we said bonds represent energy, and each one of these lines is a bond, right? So if you turn on your propane gas tank to your grill, and you add a spark or light the grill, what you'll soon find is that the grill is getting warm. there is this release of energy in the form of heat. And remember, in last week's lecture, we learned that bonds represent energy. So when you turn on that propane tank and light the grill, the reason that you're feeling heat is because these bonds, here, 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 all these bonds are being broken. And that releases heat, and that allows you to grill your veggies or your meat or whatever it is you've got on the grill there. In some cases, the organic molecules are going to have double bonds, like you see here. And remember that double bonds represent 2 electrons being shared. So if we were to count the bonds between the first carbon and the second carbon there, you've got 1, 2, 3, and then that bottom line is 4. So carbon still has made 4 covalent bonds. The difference here is that 2 of those electrons are being shared between carbon number 1 and carbon number 2. The position of those double bonds will have an effect on the molecule as well. So if we go back to the first example, there's a double bond between the first and second carbon right here, right? But in a molecule that's very similar but slightly different, we've got that double bond existing between carbons 2 and 3. So in this case, this is a slightly different compound, slightly different structure, slightly different function. This is called 2-butene, and the 2 means that the double bond is between the second and the third carbon. And this one, the first one, is called 1-butene, meaning that that double bond is between the first and the second carbon. These organic compounds can also form ring-like structures, and I apologize for the loss of formatting here. That always happens when I take the PowerPoint and put it into this program. But you can still understand the difference between these 2. This one over here is called cyclohexane. I think that's what it says. And you can see that there are single bonds all the way throughout. Single bonds between carbons all the way around. Whereas over on the right-hand side, what you see are carbons where a few of them, between 3 of the carbons, or more than that, but there are 3 double bonds here. So that changes not only the structure, but the function of this molecule. In the, what do you call those, hexagons, you see right here and right here. This is a really simplified way to draw these things. The convention here is to just assume that each corner has a carbon, and also assuming each one of these carbons has a hydrogen. Now, if it didn't have a hydrogen bonded to that carbon, it would be written in there. So let me show you, for example, here. So there may not be 2 hydrogens bonded to that carbon. It may be that it's what we call a hydroxyl group. Might look something like that. So the convention for drawing it in this way is that if none of the atoms are written, then we assume it's just carbon and hydrogen. If there are other functional groups or other atoms present, the authors will, or the writer will write that. And then also here you can see the double bonds and how they're represented in these ring compounds. Okay, so let's take a look at the main functional groups. I'll show you examples here in a second. But a hydroxyl group means that the functional group anchored to the carbon is made up of a hydrogen bonded to an oxygen. There's also a carbonyl group, a carbon that's linked by a double bond to an oxygen atom. Carboxyl group which is made up of carbon double bonded to both an oxygen and a hydroxyl group. Amino groups are made up of a nitrogen bonded to two hydrogen atoms, but also bonded to the carbon skeleton. And then also a phosphate group, which has a phosphorus atom bonded to four oxygen atoms. Let's look at that because the words probably don't mean much to you. Let's look and see what these look like. So a hydroxyl group is going to be written as an OH. I wrote that for you earlier, but here you go. You've got that OH. The oxygen is what's bonded directly to the carbon, and the hydrogen is bonded to that oxygen. Both single bonds, so they're represented by just a single line. Hydroxyl groups are commonly found in molecules that we consider alcohols, sugars, amino acids, and usually hydroxyl groups are water soluble, meaning they will dissolve in water. There's also what we call a methyl group, and a methyl group would be written like that, and what they're not showing you is the carbon chain. So you might have a whole carbon chain, and then at the end you have a carbon bonded to three hydrogens. These are found in what we call fatty acids, and those types of compounds do not dissolve in water. They're insoluble in water. Next up is a carbonyl group, where you have a carbon double bonded to an oxygen and single bonded to a hydrogen. So you have that double bond there with carbon and double bond with oxygen, single bond with the hydrogen. Other types of sugars can have carbonyl groups. Amino acids will have carbonyl groups. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, nucleotides, etc. These are water soluble. They will dissolve in water. And one of the things I want to mention before you guys get too scared is you're not going to have to know which molecules contain these functional groups. This is an introduction because we will see these functional groups later on in the semester. So don't worry too much. I'm not going to have a question like carboxyl groups can be found in what type of molecules, and then the answer would be amino acids. I'm not going to ask you that. We'll see this later on. I'd rather prefer that you know what these functional groups are, the different names for them, and be able to recognize the functional groups. And then there's an amino group. So amino groups are found in amino acids. So keep that in mind because we will learn about amino acids as we move along. And they're also found in certain nucleotide bases. And we're going to learn about those later in the lecture. They do dissolve in water. They are water soluble. They also act as a weak base. So they can pick up hydrogen ions in solution. Remember when we were learning about pH and the pH scale? Substances that are able to accept hydrogen ions or pull hydrogen ions out of solution are going to be considered bases. So here's an amino group that still has an available slot for being able to pick up a hydrogen. And then here is, and that's written as NH2. And then NH3 is what we would call an ionized amino group, meaning that it has already picked up a hydrogen ion, and it's got its other two hydrogen atoms. But remember that these functional groups have to be attached to a carbon backbone. So what would be occupying this bond right here would be a carbon chain. Okay? All right, and then phosphate groups. Let me move this slide up a little bit so you can see. Phosphate group is where you have a phosphorus right here in the center bonded to four oxygen atoms. This is something we will see, we're going to talk a whole lot about as we move through the semester. We abbreviate that as PO4. We find these in what we call nucleotides that we'll learn about in a second. Phosphate groups are found in DNA and RNA. Remember your genetic instruction booklet. Some proteins, phospholipids, which are fats, and they are water soluble. They are water soluble. Okay, let's continue on. So depending on where a functional group is found on the molecule will also determine how that molecule functions. So if we just look real quick at these two examples right here, you see that we've got estrogen and testosterone. Estrogen being the dominant female hormone, testosterone being the dominant male hormone. These two hormones give many living organisms what we recognize as female qualities and what we recognize as male qualities. So let's look at just the rings here. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4 rings for each one of these. And remember that at the corner of each one of these rings, there would be carbon atoms, right? They're just not drawing those in. And anchored to those carbons would be hydrogens, but they're just trying to make this real simple and not messy. So look at the difference between these two molecules that function very differently in living organisms. Where in estrogen, for example, you've got a hydroxyl group added to that first ring. Whereas in testosterone, that hydroxyl group is added to that fourth ring. You also see a carboxyl group here that is double bonded to that fourth ring, but in testosterone, the carboxyl group is anchored to that first ring. So we pretty much have the same number of rings, the same number of carbons, the same number of hydrogens, and the same number of oxygens, but the positioning of those functional groups and the position of those double bonds then creates different functions for these very similar molecules. So we're going to switch topics here, and we're going to talk about or learn about the processes of metabolism. When we began the lecture, we learned that these biomolecules, or these organic molecules, are made by living cells. That's true, but living cells also break down these molecules. So there are two types of metabolism. There is what we call anabolism and catabolism. You may have learned this in a nutrition class, or just maybe if you are really into working out, you know this. Anabolism is when cells build molecules from the component parts or the atoms. So you build up. Like if you think of anabolic steroids, they're building muscle. Catabolism means to break down molecules. So you might break down a long chain carbohydrate, break the bonds between those carbons, and release energy. Or if you think about that example I gave you with propane earlier, where you light the propane on fire and all those bonds are broken between the carbons and hydrogens, that's an example of catabolism. I remember the difference by thinking about cats. I love cats. I've had cats my entire life. Cats, they're always breaking something. They're scratching on your couch, or they're deliberately pushing something off of a counter just to see it fall. Cats can sometimes be a little naughty. They're going to break things. So that's the way I remember the difference between those two. So living cells are going to use a combination of anabolism and catabolism. Living cells need energy. They use energy to build up themselves, to grow, to maintain themselves. But they can't do that without something to build with. They can't do it without building blocks, right? So let's say, for instance, a cell has within it a bunch of carbon atoms, right? Well, those carbon atoms by themselves aren't going to be very useful. So the cells will, through anabolism, assemble those carbons, perhaps in a chain, maybe in a ring, perhaps with functional groups, perhaps not. So they can build up these molecules from the building blocks that they have available. Oops, I'm missing some hydrogens here. And then somewhere else in the cell, this big molecule goes and is eventually then broken down through anabolism. Remember, you can break these bonds and energy is released. That energy is used for the cell to grow and maintain itself, take care of all of its cellular activities. So cells are building up and constantly breaking down these molecules. Energy is required to build those molecules. Energy is released when those molecules are broken down. Most of these building up and breaking down chemical reactions inside of a cell are what we call enzyme driven. So enzymes we'll spend some more time on later in the semester, but an enzyme is kind of like an assistant molecule that's going to help or assist in carrying out the chemical reaction. It will speed up chemical reactions. So these enzyme-driven reactions are the essentially referring to the enzymes that drive the building, the rearranging, and the splitting of organic molecules. So these processes occur in all living cells. What we'll do now is we'll look at the types of organic molecules or biomolecules. Sometimes we call them the 4 macromolecules because they're quite large. Sometimes they're referred to as biomolecules, as I mentioned earlier. And sometimes they're just called organic compounds or organic molecules because remember, organic refers to carbon. So for the 4 main types, we've got carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Those are the 4 major macromolecules, or the 4 biomolecules, or the 4 organic molecules that cells are going to build and break down. So if we think about the building blocks, the single structures that come together to form each, in carbohydrates, you've got simple sugars. So this would be 1 molecule, but then you've got many molecules coming together to form what we call a much longer, larger structure called a carbohydrate. Glucose, for example, is a simple sugar. I'll show you some examples in a little bit. Fatty acids and glycerol come together to make lipids. So fatty acids and glycerol are the building blocks of lipids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And nucleotides are the building blocks of nucleic acids. The individual molecules, the ones we refer to as the building blocks, we call monomers. So each one of these is a monomer, right? And when they come together, when they are combined, they create polymers. So each one of these structures is a polymer. That just means it's made of many individual molecules. Okay, so monomers come together to create polymers. Look at the chemical reactions that are going to create these polymers. So when we're building molecules or breaking them down, there are two types of reactions that carry this out, like two main types. This is like two generic types of reactions. So if we're going to build a larger molecule, the way we refer to that chemical reaction is that it's a dehydration reaction. So think about that word, dehydration. If you are dehydrated, you've lost water. So what happens is over on the left, you have a short polymer. Let's just say each one of these purple balls is a carbon atom. So you've got a 3-carbon chained polymer. Polymer means few, right? So you've got a few carbon atoms, and you've got a functional group that is, you guys can say it with me, hydroxyl group. And under the right set of circumstances inside of a cell, what may happen is that this monomer, this unlinked, meaning it doesn't have any other carbons, it's just that one carbon, that's what mono means. You'll have this unlinked monomer is going to join with that short polymer. But in order for that to happen, some atoms need to be removed from each one of those existing molecules. So in this case, let me change my pen so it's not messy. When these two molecules come together, if this bond is broken between carbon and hydrogen, that means we'll lose a hydrogen. And when this bond is broken, we lose that hydroxyl group. Well, 2 hydrogens plus an oxygen come together to make water, right? So in a dehydration reaction, we lose a water molecule, right? And then what we have is a 1, 2, 3, 4 carbon compound that is now, there's a new bond here, right? So you've got this new bond right here that's been created by the loss of this hydroxyl group and this hydrogen. Cells also break down large polymers into smaller components. So let's look at the polymer up on top. Remember, each one of these purple balls, let's say, represents a carbon. And through a chemical reaction called a hydrolysis reaction, we're able to break down that polymer into a shorter polymer and a monomer. So in this reaction, this bond between these two carbons is broken, and what we have left is a 3-carbon compound, a 3-carbon polymer, and a monomer. This requires the addition of water. So hydro means water. Oops. Lysis means to split. So in a hydrolysis reaction, water splits the bond or breaks the bond between two existing atoms in a larger molecule. This is why water is so important for your everyday activities. Every single one of those billions of cells that make up your body are going to require water for these types of reactions. So if you are too dehydrated, severely dehydrated, or dehydrated for a long period of time, these types of reactions slow down, and that can be detrimental to your living cells. It could cause cells to die. Remember, this type of reaction is breaking a bond. And when you break bonds, you release energy. So in order for your cells to get energy to carry out their daily activities and just live, they need energy to do that. So if you can't do that, your cells are going to run out of energy, and your cells are going to start dying, and then you can imagine how that affects tissues, organs, organ systems, and then ultimately the whole organism. So remember, dehydration reactions and hydrolysis reactions are how we form polymers or how we break down polymers. So before we start learning about those four major macromolecules, carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, I want to show you a little bit more complex of an example of a dehydration reaction. So these ring structures that you see on the top, this is glucose. This is what we call a monosaccharide. And sac means sugar. So glucose is a type of monosaccharide. It's a very simple sugar. Remember, you'll have carbons, unless otherwise stated, you got carbons at each one of these corners, right? So you've got this single sugar in this ring-like structure, and it has a hydroxyl group attached to it. Over on the other side, same thing. It's the glucose molecule is just split. So you've got a hydroxyl group here, right? But what's going to happen is we're only going to break off that hydrogen. We're not going to break off the oxygen as well. So when these two molecules come together in a chemical reaction, in a dehydration reaction, remember that a water is lost. So we're going to lose this water. We're going to lose this hydrogen and oxygen and lose that hydrogen. And then a bond is going to be created between those two molecules with this oxygen. And that's what you see right here. And now you've got something called a disaccharide. Di means two sugars. So now you've got two sugars that have bonded together using an oxygen atom, and it creates a different sugar called maltose. So this is just another example of a dehydration reaction, how from two simple sugars here and here, or two monosaccharides, we make a disaccharide at the bottom. Go back a slide. And let's say, for instance, you've had some maltose. If you like malts are not the same as shakes, right? Malts are a little bit different. They're a little bit thicker. Malts are called malts because the sugar that's used is called maltose. Anyways, so with these short chain carbohydrates, or all carbohydrates, these bonds are broken pretty easy. All these bonds are broken up. When you ingest a carbohydrate, those bonds are broken pretty quick. And the shorter the chains are, so monosaccharides and disaccharides, because they're such small molecules, these bonds get broken down and broken down quite easily. And this releases energy. Remember, every time that you break a bond between an atom, energy is released. So monosaccharides and disaccharides and oligosaccharides, they offer very quick energy for when you need it. So it's like having energy on hand. So now we're going to start learning about those four major macromolecules. Remember, one of them is carbohydrates. So we're only going to discuss the most abundant ones, but there are three main types of carbohydrates. Sometimes they're just called saccharides because that's the Latin term. So the three main types, one would be a monosaccharide. Remember, a mono means one. So you just have one sugar molecule like you saw in the previous example. Another example would be what we call oligosaccharides, where you have short chains of sugars, so maybe like 3 to 6. I'm just giving you an example. And then the third is what we call a polysaccharide. Poly means many. So here in a polysaccharide, you might have hundreds or thousands of monosaccharides all bonded to one another to make what we call a complex carbohydrate. Before I show you some examples of these, let's think about the functions of carbohydrates. And you probably already are familiar with this. If you've dieted or if you exercise and follow a certain diet, you're probably very familiar with the functions of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are a great source of energy, instant energy, meaning your body can break the bonds between those carbon atoms and instantly use those carbon atoms for energy. Even the long chain carbohydrates, the polysaccharides, those are going to be used for instant energy as well. But those polysaccharides are going to, because they're so long, imagine like 1,000 carbon atoms in a chain, right? Those are going to last a little bit longer. So if you've heard of carb loading before an endurance event, like having a pasta meal before running a marathon, you're loading up on pasta, which are polysaccharides. And because these polysaccharides are so long and there's so many bonds, they're going to give you more energy while you're doing that endurance activity, because there's so many bonds to be broken, and every time a bond is broken, energy is released. Carbohydrates also serve as transportable or storable forms of energy. So carbohydrates can bond to other molecules and transport those molecules to other areas in the organism or in your body, but also in storable forms of energy. So if you were to eat a big pasta meal one night or just whenever, and then not utilize that energy, your body goes, whoa, hold on a second. This is a great source of energy, but I don't need it right now. It's going to store those carbohydrates somewhere in your body as a compound called glycogen. So glycogen gets stored, at least in the human body, in the liver or between muscles, and your body's like, okay, thanks for giving me all those carbohydrates. I don't need them right now, but I'm going to save them for when I do. In plants, for instance, structural or carbohydrates are good for creating the wall of plant cells. So, for instance, cellulose is a type of polysaccharide, a type of carbohydrate that makes up the cell wall of a plant cell. So individual plant cells have this really thick wall that surrounds them. We'll just draw the nucleus in right there. That's all made of cellulose. So in that respect, carbohydrates can be used as structural material. Here are just a couple of examples of two monosaccharides. You've seen glucose before, right? And this is the type of molecule that goes into all of your cells and is used as real quick energy. These bonds can be broken really quick inside your cells, and energy can be immediately released. This is the preferred form of energy for your cells. You can also use fats or lipids and proteins as energy, but your body would rather not, at least in humans anyways. It would much rather go to its glucose stores first. So here's what it looks like on the bottom in its ring structure. Here's just another way to draw it in its chain form. You don't need to know the difference, or you don't need to be able to draw the different structures. I'm just demonstrating that glucose can sometimes look a little bit different. Its molecular formula would be, oops. Oh no, hold on. Shame on me. Okay, I can't get back to that. Its molecular formula would be C6H12O6. And that really just refers to the number of carbons, the number of hydrogens, and the number of oxygens. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. And then if you want to count with me the number of hydrogens, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 hydrogens. And then lastly, we use green, bad color, sorry. There are going to be 6 oxygens. See if you can find the 6 oxygens, or count those 6 oxygens. I'll help you out if we start at the top and we go around counterclockwise. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So I'm primarily going to be using the molecular formula that you see down here because it's easiest to write and it's easiest to recognize how many atoms are in that molecule, how many of each atom is in that molecule. Here's another example of a simple sugar called fructose. Fructose is slightly different in its conformation or its structure, and therefore is going to function a little bit differently. So in the ring, for example, you have 5 carbons. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oops, just kidding, you have 6. It's just this, it's a 6-carbon compound, but the carbons aren't in the ring. I shouldn't have said that they're all in the ring. They are attached to the central carbons, the ring carbons. And then you've got, let's see if we can draw this. C6, did we count all the carbons? Yeah, we counted all the carbons. We've got 6 carbons. And then let's go ahead and count the oxygens. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, oh, sorry about that. That's a horrible color. I know better. And then let's count the hydrogens. You've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Seven, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. Oh my goodness. Hang in there with me. C6H12O5. Is that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm wrong. C6H12O6. So my point here is that the molecular formulas between glucose and fructose are the same, but the arrangement of the atoms in the molecule is different. And then if we're talking about long-chain carbohydrates or complex carbohydrates, polysaccharides, then they get really complex. So this would be like what pasta looks like on a molecular level, where you have many carbon chains. These are all glucose molecules. So you've got glucose molecules lined up end to end to end. So you've got all these glucose molecules all bonded together. And now you see a much more complex structure. And if you remember from our last lecture, what type of bond is being created here? So these are hydrogen bonds. Remember, hydrogen bonds are created between hydrogen atoms and an electronegative atom. So you've got these hydrogen atoms bonding or weakly attracted to the oxygen atoms, which are very electronegative. And remember that these hydrogen bonds are responsible for the folding of molecules. So rather than having thousands of molecules in a straight chain, these molecules start to interact with one another. They start to bond with one another because of that hydrogen bonding. So it causes these molecules to become folded. And in a more complex example, and you can't see the hydrogen bonds here, but now you've got hydrogen bonds interacting between these atoms here, these molecules here. And now you've got, rather than a folded, pleated structure, now you've got this spiral-like structure. So you see that as you add more molecules to a carbohydrate chain or more saccharides to a carbohydrate chain, the chain gets more complex and its shape changes. And remember, when the shape changes, the function is going to change as well. And then lastly, I'll just tell you or just show you some examples of complex carbohydrates. Of course, we know pastas are complex carbohydrates, right? You've got legumes or different types of beans. Those are made up of complex carbohydrates. Veggies like carrots, bread, all of these food items that you see up here would be considered as having or containing complex carbohydrates. And then, so that's food, right? So I'm always thinking about food. I always try and give you a food example. But let's think about the exoskeleton of this centipede here. So an exoskeleton is this insect skeleton. You know how you have a skeleton on the inside? Insects carry their skeleton on the outside. So all of this black here that you see is its exoskeleton, and even the leg parts here too. The soft tissue would be on the inside of there. All of that is made up of complex carbohydrates. Okay, this is the end of part 1 for the chapter 3 lecture, and stay tuned for part 2.